So my name is Patricia Pino, and I am co-host of the MMT podcast, which I co-host with Christian Riley. We are MMT activists in the UK, and a lot of us are involved in the Labour Party and other left-wing parties as well, the Green Party and other outside of any parties as well in various movements. And our objectives are to spread knowledge and about how currencies and the economy works, in order for left-wing groups and grassroots organizations to be able to further their objectives with a ground understanding of these concepts. The reason why I wasn't happy about the results is because the people that Keir Starmer surrounds himself with in terms of economic policy are very much still married to a very old understanding of the economic system, which ultimately helps the austerity narrative and the Tory kind of narrative of the economy. So for that reason, I wasn't at all happy, and I have been considering and pondering about what the next step might be, of whether Labour is still the best vehicle to achieve the change that we need to achieve, or whether it would be better to try to work outside the party instead. Yes, and I think that there are two kind of main divisions among the Corbyn supporters that maybe, again, that they are not sure whether it's better to stay and fight, as they say, or whether it's better to work outside the party. And I think the big kind of the main reason for that is, of course, the first past the post system, and a lot of people see Labour as the only alternative to the Conservatives, and they may well be right. So I completely respect that position of stay in and fight no matter what. But at the same time, I think that this is going to be a slow burner. I think that even if any progress can be done inside the party, it's going to be painfully slow, unless we can maybe pair that up with some action outside the party, to which the party then is ultimately forced to react to, and much in the way like, say, UKIP and the Tories did, you know. So maybe there is also an argument for the other side of the supporters to say, you know, at the moment Labour is dead, let's look for other options outside the party. And that this doesn't mean division necessarily of the movement, but it does mean a different way of working together. So MMT is just a description of how currencies work. It is not a policy prescription. It is not this is how we should run the economy. It is this is how it currently works right now. And as such, it is not, we like to say it's politically agnostic, in the sense that it is not inherently supportive of a capitalist system or a socialist system. It really is just the knowledge that you need in order to be able to design the system that you want. So it belongs to the heterodox school of thought, which runs opposite to the orthodox school of thought, otherwise known as neoclassical economics, or colloquially neoliberal economics. And its basic premises are that, first of all, the states, a nation state that has its own central bank, a floating exchange rate, and that means that its currency is not pegged to another currency or to an asset like gold, and that it has little debt denominated in a foreign currency, can be regarded as monetarily sovereign governments, and these governments issue their own currency, and they have no purely financial constraints on their spending. So they effectively create money as they spend it. The second premise is that all economies and all governments, they face real constraints on their economies. And by real, we need actual material things such as that we produce and consume, such as food, such as machinery, such as technology and labor. And what a nation can do, and the kind of standard of living that it can provide its citizens is pretty much determined by the availability of real stuff. So the third premise is that the government's deficit, or what it spends, is everyone else's surplus. So this is just kind of an accounting principle of double entry bookkeeping. So if someone's income is someone else's spending, as we like to say, or every lender has a borrower. So there's always two sides of the equation. In the financial system as a whole, for the pound sterling, for example, all these operations have to account to zero. So all the surpluses and deficits add up to zero. But when it comes to the government and the non-government sector, which is us, all the deficit that the government issues then has to be our surplus. It has to be our net savings, as we like to call it. So that's kind of the three basic principles. And I think at this point, when people are told these things about the government not having purely financial constraints, their heads go straight to inflation. Zimbabwe, Venezuela. This has happened, and I think that the problem is that the stories about countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe and the Weimar Republic in Germany have usually been oversimplified to this kind of just blame government spending for all its problems, and this is a narrative that has helped to kind of instill that fear of government spending. But if you look into detail as what happened in these economies, and you start looking at the fact that their economic problems actually started with real constraints of the real resources and things that they need to produce. So, for example, you get in the Weimar Republic, the hyperinflation actually started with the invasion of the rural industrial area by the French as a result of Germany not being able to catch up with its foreign debt responsibilities. So that kind of immediately took out quite a large part of the production capacity of Germany as a whole. And once you have a collapse of that size, then obviously, if Germany continues to pay the workers as it did, then there wasn't enough real products or real services and goods in order to people to buy with German currency. And that kind of created that inflationary episode. The same with countries like Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, it was a similar story in the sense that it was the land redistribution that happened, that regardless of whether this was fair or not, and people will have different opinions, it was a political decision. And this kind of the way it was done, it was just done, it really undermined the farming production of the country. And if you see the agricultural output of the nation at that time, it completely collapsed. And that effectively had the same effect as as what happened in Germany. So considering especially that in Zimbabwe up until then agricultural industry was its largest industry and the one that they depended upon. So it was a huge shock on the supply side. It wasn't just the government spent and suddenly there was hyperinflation everywhere. These things rarely happen that way. And if you listen to what politicians are saying in the Tory party at the moment, those in charge like the health secretary and the chancellor, they are both saying things like there is, money is no object here. We will do whatever it takes to get us out of this problem. And in many of their policies, like the support for the wages that by the state, they are saying effectively things like there is unlimited funding guaranteed for these things. So it is obvious that they know what the true capacity of the state is. And these are things that MMT has been saying for a while. Of course, there is nervousness from some quarters, and is warranted, as well as some journalists have been pointing out that, who are familiar with the austerity narrative, they have been pointing out, wait, are we going to have to pay this afterwards? And what does that mean? The government has largely been avoiding that question. If you are right now start thinking about what you might need to pay afterwards, then you are obviously going to restrain in some way the actions that you're doing now, and that's going to undermine the government actions. But the reality is also that we don't need to pay this money back, because the government is effectively creating money as it spends. And the government debt is simply an accounting operation where of a result of double entry bookkeeping, where if the government then spends into the economy, then it has to add a minus figure for the equivalent number somewhere within their accounts. And so we don't really, and they are considering things like, for example, the Bank of England recently said that they were going to buy bonds directly from the government, which meant that the government wouldn't have to go through the private sector first, and then the government would do its process of buying bonds from the secondary market instead of directly from the government. So that just kind of goes to show how things work in reality, in a sense, because if they can work that way now, if the central bank can just buy bonds directly from the treasury, then why not do it like that always? And I guess this is also a testing time, because a lot of people would suggest that policies like that are inherently inflationary, and I think they're in for a surprise, or is going to disprove that notion that kind of operation is inflationary. And in fact, what MMT says is that there is no difference between whether you go through the secondary market first or not for treasury bonds, and the central bank buys them. The central bank can buy them directly. The central bank is a branch of government after all, and it has to finance government spending. I mean, the stock market is just it's just an expression of how profitable people think these companies might be, and profit in itself doesn't always run side to side with our public objectives. So, what's good for a healthcare company in terms of profit, if it was private, is not necessarily what's good for the health of the public. So, there is a danger there, and there's always I think they try to portray the stock market as inherently displaying the health of the economy, but there is a lot of ground to say that it actually isn't, and actually it just represents the profit potential of a small section of the economy. So the issue here, I think, is that in the neoclassical school of thought, you have the inherent belief that government should just leave the market to it. Kind of all values created through the capitalist system by private entities, and government can only really kind of absorb what the private sector is doing before spending it into public sector. So within the neoclassical view, government is entirely dependent on the profit of the private sector, or on the success of private companies in order to then provide public services. And what MMT is saying is effectively turning that on its head. It's saying that the government has an active role in employing and ensuring the well-being of its citizens, and creating value for the public, and in pursuing public goals. So the stock market is not really shouldn't really be the focus here, but there is a potential for depression, of course, because people are not gaining incomes now that we have we have kind of this is sort of a voluntary kind of slowdown, economic slowdown. Government is actively legislating to keep workers at home because we need them to stay at home, because otherwise, in order to control the virus. So it's the challenge, which is happening right now, is that we're actively, willfully shutting down sections of our economy that we consider to be non-essential. And at the same time, we need to protect incomes. So we're both reducing the amount of stuff that we make, but also reducing the incomes of people if they get laid off, etc. So your problem is twofold. You need to make sure that people have enough income, they still have things they need to live, they can still enjoy well-being, and you don't start seeing mass loan defaulting and homes being repossessed, etc. But also you need to make sure that you continue in as much as possible and safely to produce the things that we need in order to sustain those workers in their homes or wherever they may be. And so that means that they have to address two sides of the problem. What the government is doing right now, unfortunately, is they're addressing the incomes. They're not doing it full-heartedly, but what they are doing is mostly addressed at the incomes. And there is little really, but they're just kind of hoping that the market will sort everything else out, rather than actually saying, okay, what needs to happen? What industries need to grow now? What industries, for example, mental health, education needs restructuring. We need to produce masks. We need to produce medical equipment. That also needs addressing. But instead of doing that, they're basically just saying, have this money, not all the money that you could have before, and just kind of let that move through the market, and the market will find a way of sorting itself out. So that's really insufficient. But there is a likelihood that there are dangers with regards to what might happen, for example, to production if certain industries lose too many workers to quarantine. We're already seeing that in the NHS, that a lot of people are being laid off, not laid off, but are being temporarily staying at home, and therefore I think the figure was about 15% or something of doctors and nurses being currently in quarantine. So that has a ripple effect, and the government should have an active role in preventing those things from happening. But at the same time, it needs to guarantee incomes. It needs to make sure people can pay their rents or altogether cancel their rents. And it needs to, otherwise you're going to start seeing mass defaulting, people not paying council taxes, and therefore councils themselves being less able to provide services. And all of that will, basically, you'll see all the dominoes. When the government charges taxes, they destroy the money, effectively. If government spending creates money, then taxing is the opposite operation, and that money is destroyed. So there is no. People like to imagine like there is like this kind of savings account that the government has, and that all the taxes go in there, and then the government, before spending, they look at what they have in taxes and they go, oh no, we can only afford this much. No, that's kind of a household budget understanding of the economy, and is misguided and is very problematic in terms of trying to gain support for public purpose if they think that government is constrained that way. And I think both the right and left use that or believe that this kind of talk of taxpayers' money is actually a positive thing, even though they do it for different things. So the right will mostly use it to say you can't afford public services because we will have to tax you more if we do. And the left use it to say we need to tax the rich so that we can then have public services. And I kind of empathize with what the left are trying to do there. They're trying to kill two birds with one stone, get it at the rich and at the same time make sure that we have the public services we need. But actually, the narrative itself is problematic because what it's saying is that it's validating something that Thatcher said in the 1970s, and that is that the government has no money of its own, other than the money that people earn themselves. Basically, the government is helpless, and we depend on what the people earn for a living in order for the government to be able to accomplish any of its objectives. If you have that understanding of the economy, then naturally, I think you're going to assign a sense of virtue to people who earn the most, because you start thinking, well, they are producing more for the country if they are earning the most. Therefore, and they're paying the most taxes. Therefore, they are, funding our NHS. And there is this notion that, we owe the rich the public services like the NHS, or that without the rich, we wouldn't be able to have these services. And so from then stems off this fear of scaring away the rich. What happens if they leave? Oh, no. Richard Branson might not, his companies may not be here anymore, and then what will happen to the NHS? So I think overall the narrative is, Thatcher used it for a reason, and I think it's because she could see that ultimately the narrative elevated the rich, elevated the taxpayer, and diminished government, who is our democracy as flawed as it is. Government is still the best route for collective action that we have, and the best chance for democracy that ordinary people have. So that was her way of undermining that, basically. I mean, when we say that MMT is about the limit to government spending is about how much you can actively produce, there is scope there for disagreement as to what constitutes productive work. So for the Tory party, for example, a lot of the financial sector would have been the most important sector in our society for their own reasons. But if you look at it closely, you realize actually this sector produces nothing in the sense of making, people's lives better, nothing tangible to prove for it. So we have to... I think the Tory view of the economy is almost like the market, leave the market on its own, and the market decides what constitutes productive and what is valuable to us. Whereas the MMT view would be more like actually what is valuable, or what we want to, what things that we want in our economy are about democracy and are about what the government's objectives are. And that in itself is influenced by culture, is influenced by many things, by current political status. So I don't think that's going to be necessarily, MMT, as I said earlier on, that it's politically agnostic. And I think that a lot of people within the Tory party already understand a lot of aspects of how the economy actually works. Otherwise, Hancock and the Chancellor wouldn't be saying that there is unlimited funding. But they will still exploit this idea of a household budget when it's politically convenient to do so, because they know that their economic priorities, it would be very difficult to sell otherwise. How do you sell the fact that, there shouldn't be a public NHS and it should all be privatized unless you claim that you can't afford it? There's only really that. So I think what I'm hoping for MMT to do in terms of kind of the political effect that it might have is not so much that suddenly everybody would be left wing and everybody would and our priorities would change, but it would at the very least expose the ideologies of either party for all to see. It would expose the Tory support for private enterprise, and people would be able to see through them straight away when they claim to support the NHS while doing everything to undermine it. And at the same time, it would show that a lot of the Labour policies that we had at the last election were actually guided by sound economics, even though there was so much scaremongering around it. That we are limited by what we have. So employment is our most precious resource. Labour is our most precious resource. And that means that the government is limited by the people who are available to work in providing the services that the government wants to provide. So then in MMT we say that the government can afford anything that is available for sale in its own currency. So if there is, and that includes all labour that is not being currently utilised by the private sector. So it effectively says that there is no need for unemployment, and that these unemployment policies that have been, that the unemployment that we have observed for the last 10 years or so, and you know, since for the last 40 years, has been really a matter of public policy, a political choice. So so we can spend money until full employment, effectively. We have used all the resources that we have, and we decide how much, you know, what is it that our production priorities are, what is it that the services that we want to produce are, but also if the government then decides, because you can have full employment, but you can have either 80% of your employment workforce being employed by the private sector, or you can have 20% of the workforce being employed by the private sector. So there are, you know, you can still have different sizes to the state on full employment scenarios, but we then have to. So the way that the government may want to increase its take of the employment workforce would be done by increasing taxes. And therefore, what taxes would do in that situation is kind of, we say, create fiscal space. So it opens up a space, it creates unemployment, effectively, so that the government can then spend into that to employ even more people. So that's kind of the idea about it, that we are just constrained by the real resources that we have in our economy. Okay, so there are various versions of UBI, but I think the most popular one, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the most popular UBI version would be to say that that the government would give everybody what is effectively a living wage, and therefore it would kind of, the idea is that it would free workers from the requirement to find employment. So there are various problems with that, but the underlying, I guess the underlying idea is that there are shared objectives, in the sense that both the job guarantee and the UBI, both groups are kind of, they want to ensure that everybody has a decent income and that everybody can afford to live a decent life, and that doesn't just mean basic food and housing. It also means social participation, entertainment, holidays, etc. The issue with that is that UBI deals with the income aspect of things. It doesn't deal so much with the production aspect of things. So a job guarantee is effectively connecting government spending to productive outcomes. And that not just is a way of giving people an income, but it's also, on the other hand, making sure that we have the goods and services for that income to buy. So it's, as a result, there is the risk of inflation with a job guarantee is much lower than the risk of inflation through UBI. And people say that, okay, well, if I receive the UBI, then a lot more people may be entrepreneurs and a lot of people may do these things. But there's, you also are restricting the government's ability to organize these resources in the interest of the public good. You are relying entirely on the market again to kind of resolve itself and kind of find the way to provide these things for society. And the other thing is that the UBI, I mean, some people, yes, sure, they'll become entrepreneurs. Some people can find employment. But UBI also doesn't deal with doesn't guarantee everybody employment. And there is value in employment beyond the income that we get. There has been studies, for example, showing that employment is associated with mental health, that it gives community cohesion, that it helps us feel more integrated with our communities, and also more, as a result of that, more increased political participation. So it's generally just good for your well-being, good for democracy, but also UBI doesn't actually resolve that problem. Some people may still be able to find work, and some people may become entrepreneurs, but there will still be a minority who want a job, who cannot get a job. So the job guarantee option, what it effectively does is it wants people to recognize that everybody who wants to work and can work should have a right to a job, and they should have a right to participate in the production processes of the community that they find themselves in. And so, and at the same time, this gives them the opportunity to gain an income which is what we call socially inclusive. So it's not just a living wage; it's also all sorts of benefits, holidays, as well as entertainment. You know, whatever. To be honest, the level of income is really whatever we as a society decide should be the minimum acceptable standard of living that we should accept in our communities. And so as a result, that's the kind of the main reason why we prefer the job guarantee, that the UBI doesn't actually resolve the problem, and actually still says that the government cannot resolve the unemployment problem. There are other issues with it, but I think that there is this idea about us becoming kind of a post-work society. And there is the kind of this vision, but I think that is very easy to call yourself a post-work society if then you're importing all your goods that workers in other economies are creating, and who cannot have a post-work society. There are other benefits in that for example, if we accept that the goods that we need to produce and the services that we need to produce as a society so that people can lead happy lives and fulfilling lives are everyone's responsibility, then you accept that we can share that burden equitably, and that could lead, for example, to a reduction in work hours for everybody. So you could achieve things like the 4-day work week, and yet have everybody in employment, but just everybody working a little less. So these kind of things then become possible with a job guarantee. With a UBI, I fear that the pool of people who would still not have access to a job and yet are in receipt of a UBI, they are likely to be demonized in the same way that we've seen benefit receivers demonized over the last few decades. So you'd still have that division. That's another reason why I prefer the job guarantee to a UBI. More thing.
Yeah.
Within the MMT community, there are various views as well with regards to whether it might be possible, for example, to mix a UBI with a job guarantee, or mix a basic income, which is not universal but would be given to people who are not taking the job guarantee. So there is discrepancy. Not everybody in the MMT community has exactly the same views, but everybody does accept, I think, the fact that the job guarantee is a better option generally, but they're willing to adapt or incorporate aspects of UBI thinking into the job guarantee. The job guarantee scheme would work by, we say it's centrally funded and locally administered. So the role of the central government would really begin and end in simply providing local communities with the funds they needed to fund a job guarantee. The reason why it has to be locally administered is because, and I'm going to make the assumption here that it would be local councils running this, even though it doesn't have to be. But the reason why it would be good for it to be locally administered is because, for example, local councils have a better idea of what local needs are, and they will diverge enormously in needs across the country. And the councils that are enduring the worst unemployment will naturally be the ones receiving the most funding. There are, as the efforts with the locally administered as well, is because there is hope that we could set up a system that is democratic in the sense that people themselves who are going to be part of the job guarantee or who are within the community would then decide or have an input in making recommendations about the jobs that they would like to do. And this could be done simple by submitting proposals, as well as voting for different priorities, local priorities. But also, for example, if you are yourself somebody who suddenly says, well, I'd like to take a job guarantee job, but there's nothing here that I like, and I think I have a better idea as to what needs to be done in my community, and I can put a proposal together and I say, for example, I think that it would be great to draw murals in this part of town on these walls that are bare, and I think this would benefit the children who can't play here, for example. And he said, well, I can do it, and I can do it in this time. Then they can submit their own proposals, and you can then have a sort of kind of social entrepreneurship approach to it. And so there is a desire to open this up and about the definition of what a job really is, or what we want things to be done. And I think that's part of the kind of pushback against the job guarantee, is because people cannot immediately think about or imagine what kind of jobs they would be doing in it. So they tend to think that it'll be things like stacking shelves or Tesco's or something like that. But actually, once you actually start thinking about it and ask people what services would you like within your community, you'll find that there is a ton of things that people would like more things to get done, and they start identifying things. Actually, it would be nice if somebody did this. Actually, it would be nice if somebody did that. But also, I think we need to start not so much with obsessed about the jobs being perfect, but simply recognize that everybody should start with the premise that everybody should have an access to a job, and then these issues of how what the things that we work on and how do we make those the most useful and flexible within our communities, that can get resolved eventually. I mean, in as much as MMT is what we, is how the things work now, then MMT is compatible with what we have at the moment. MMT is also compatible with a system where the government has a much larger role. And it really is just about the legislative framework and regulatory framework that the government decides on, and hopefully through democratic means. So yes, I mean, we could have a system that is like the one that we currently have, which is very, very, there is so much abuse, and there is so much exploitation, and there's a lot of suffering. And as still have the currency work in the way that MMT works, or we could have we could make use of the knowledge of MMT to then set up a system where actually we nationalize things like the pensions. Now that we know that the government can afford the pensions, For example, that we don't rely on the stock market for that kind of thing, and we just simply guarantee everybody a decent income at the end of their employment life. So that aspect of things, and then or we can start thinking then about, for example, what kind of services as a minimum we want to guarantee citizens. Like we could guarantee everybody a house, we could guarantee everybody a minimum basket of food. We could really go wherever we really want to go with this, and we are the ones who decide the true extent to which we want to take the government's power. But you will also, this has to be decided by democratic means, and you will always have that group in society who will fight for, more private enterprise and less government involvement. I don't think that's going to put an end to that discussion, but at least then the discussion can be done on the basis of how things really work, as opposed to what we have now. Yeah. I mean, there is two aspects to this, because obviously, if you have a government which is not democratic, and ours isn't perfect by any means, but if you have a government that is not democratic, then there is an argument to say that what authority do they have to introduce themselves into private lives? But when in a situation where you have a government that is democratic or in the process of getting democratic, then you can say that the distinction is really about how much, the balance in between individual rights or individual freedoms versus a collective freedom to society and a collective means of organizing. So, and it will always be a matter of debate as to on one side or what side that falls in. But I think at the very least, in terms of socialist principles, we can really make a case for public ownership when we understand the true power of the state currency, and that governments can create value. Comment on what people are seeing right now on the politics, and highlight that that things already work in this way. There has been a huge effort, and I'm a late comer to it. I've been involved in this for maybe about 5 years, but the academics that have been involved in it have been doing this for the last 3 decades. It has been a really slow burner, and it really feels that we're at the end of it, and that things are picking up a lot, partly because of the crisis. Sadly, it's not nice to say, but crises do push governments to the limits of what is possible. The same thing happened during World War II. So MMT will likely be proven right as a result of this, and we hope that it will be a lot harder than to make a case for austerity after the crisis is gone. That's not to say they won't try, because they will try, but I think they won't find an electorate which is as willing to accept that narrative now as they were in 2010. But that depends a lot about us and disseminating this knowledge, and mostly kind of making people understand what MMT is, but also how it would help them achieve their objectives, or how does it reflect on their political priorities and on what it means for that. But a lot of the hope I have is to do with younger economic students, and who are graduating soon as well, who have grown up in the time of MMT, and who would be the next ones to take the mantle on the next generation of politicians. And so there is a lot to hope for, but I don't think that Keir Starmer's style of leadership really lends itself well to that kind of new thinking approach. I think he's going to want to make allegiances with people in whose interest is not to change the narrative, really. I think that we have an account called the @MMT podcast account on Twitter. usually either myself or Christian will respond to any questions people will have. There is also an organization in the UK called the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies, and they are a fantastic group of women who dedicate themselves solely to the dissemination of MMT knowledge in the UK. A lot of them are well-seasoned activists for the NHS and other causes, and they have a great collection of sources, of academic sources for people who really want to get into it, into the kind of nit-grit of it. But myself and Christian, we in the MMT podcast, we usually focus on kind of the newcomers and just trying to explain things to people, to lay people who may not have any previous kind of understanding of economics, for that matter. So I think that's a good side. There's the GIMS website, the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies. The website is gims.org.uk, so gims.org.uk, and just tweet the MMT podcast for any questions you might have.